And if indeed the surge is going to fail in Iraq and will fail in Afghanistan, what are we then left with? Well, of course, one crucial part of the President's foreign policy agenda was to in some way engage with Iran, in some way find a way of engaging with Iran to prevent Iran from becoming the dominant power opposed to the American presence inside the Middle East. And that, I think, in some ways was more important than the nuclear issue that plays such a large part in everyone's discussions of Iran. And it seemed as if it was a valid approach. Iranians generally, including large elements inside the Iranian administration, want engagement. They want recognition of their geopolitical location inside the Middle East, of the role that they could play, and they would rather do it in partnership with the United States than in opposition to it. One could indeed argue that a large part of Iranian policy over the last 5 years has been really geared towards making that simple truth evident to an American administration. And no one comes along which appears to be prepared to embrace that. Well, it was a very nice idea. I would say since June the 12th, that possibility, in the short term at least, if not in the medium term, has simply disappeared. The way in which the elections were rigged in Iran, and they were rigged, and the reasons why they were rigged, which has to do with the change in the nature of the Iranian political system from that of a consultative democracy into a theocratic autocracy, mean that it will now be extremely difficult for any American administration to openly engage in a positive sense until in some way the crisis inside Iran has been resolved. And that means all has to go on hold. And of course, as everything goes on hold, so the nuclear program issue will continue. Iran has said it will no longer negotiate with Europe on the nuclear issue. It has made it clear that any attempt to interfere with what it regards its sovereign interests will be met forcefully, and that means criticism from the United States. Britain at the moment is the target, but that's partly because Britain's an easy target for anybody, and therefore we've been victimised, but the United States is always there to become the great Satan once again. And until the argument between Hajjat Salam Rafsanjani on the one hand and Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, on the other, has been resolved, it's very difficult to see a way forward in terms of constructive foreign policy. So one part of the President's agenda has fallen away. And I think it will take until the end of his first term before one can think of reviving it, and then only if Iran in some way restores the situation that existed before the crisis developed. That may happen more quickly than we think. But by that time, Iran may well have become a nuclear threshold state. And that, I suspect, is its real objective. And the question then is, what do you do about that? Well, the Obama administration made it clear that it didn't think military mechanisms would be a way of dealing with this, or it made that point up until 3 days ago. And then Senator Biden, who plays a considerable part inside the foreign policy process, made a statement in which he said basically it may be necessary for the United States to leave the issue of Iran to Israel. That can only have one meaning, that the United States will acquiesce in a military attack on Iran. And that, of course, carries all the dangers it did before, with the added danger that there will now be a regime in place which will be even more intolerant of interference than would have been the case in the past. So it seems to me that the President's Iranian policy, for reasons quite beyond his control, is really in tatters. Now you might argue, well, he could adjust, he could make adaptations, but there's a domestic agenda too. And I don't think American public opinion will tolerate concessions towards Iran in its current state. And that's going to be a very powerful drag on his freedom of action. If that's the case with Iran, just consider what it means with Israel. If you like, the current issue. Now, the United States has said, or the Obama administration has said, that it wants to see a two-state solution with a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and that as part of the process of achieving that, settlement activity must stop, preparatory to a removal of the settlements. Well, I've heard in my life many comments by politicians that have seemed rather fanciful. I have to say, I think that's one of the most fanciful aspirations I've ever come across. The Netanyahu government, of course, depends on America. Of course, it can't resist real American pressure, should that ever come. But real American pressure can only come about if American public opinion is prepared to tolerate it. And American public opinion simply won't. Anything which appears to be, or is portrayed to be, a real threat to the security of Israel will not be acceptable. So in a sense, the United States President is pointing a gun at Israel which can't be loaded. And then beyond that too, when you consider what in fact there is there left to create a second state out of, you begin to see again how unrealistic this is. Gaza, isolated, destroyed after the war last December, can't be engaged politically because of an asinine decision on the part of the European Union and the United States at Israeli behest to isolate Hamas. So it's not possible to modify Hamas's behaviour. You can't even engage with it, and you can't even at the moment reconstruct Gaza to relieve the 100,000 Palestinians who are now in a desperate plight. Beyond that, then there's the West Bank, the part of Palestine that we can openly support under a government, under Mahmoud Abbas, which is actually legitimate because his period as president ran out in January. No elections are planned until next January. So here we have a half-legitimate government operating with a half-legitimate military movement behind it and an illegitimate parliament to authenticate and legitimize its actions in a piece of territory where movement is blocked by 630 separate blockades, which is so honeycombed by roads and settlements that it's quite inconceivable to see how out of that a coherent, cohesive political unit could be forged. And against that too, the evidence that the Israeli authorities, and people blame Netanyahu, but it's not just him, any Israeli leader, is not prepared to stop settlement building and expansion. Only a week ago, 50 homes out of a total of 1,500 new homes and settlements was authorized, a direct affront to the American president. I don't see yet any evidence that the Obama administration is really prepared to confront the Netanyahu government over that issue. And if it doesn't, and soon, all the wishes and good aspirations and hopes and rhetoric of the Cairo speech will simply be wasted. So it's very difficult for me to see how the Obama administration can advance any of its agendas inside the Middle East. It's blocked in Iran for reasons beyond its control. It's blocked in the case of Israel for reasons that reflect its domestic situation. And it's blocked in the case of Iraq because it's now abandoned control there. And it will be blocked in Afghanistan because there it cannot achieve the impossible. And therefore, my conclusion has to be that despite the aspirations, despite the intensely sensible, well thought out proposals made by the President, he will not really be able to advance on any of these agendas. Don't forget, he's got 1.5 years before he has to begin to think about re-election. In 1.5 years, he can't begin to solve the problems I've described. And if he can't then solve them, he'll have to wait a further 2 years until the election's over to begin again a process which might then be one on which he can concentrate. But by then, you need to consider, what will Middle Eastern attitudes be? I don't think they're going to believe in the values, possibilities and objectives that he outlined in Cairo at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.